start the I'll start the recording. I think they've added that voice specially to remind me that that's how it should be. What they ought to have is a voice that says, "You've forgotten to switch the record on," which would be much more helpful. But never mind, they're doing their best. This evening, I've been a bit preoccupied today over the business of witnessing. We talk a lot about Christian witness, both the witness of the community and also the witness of individual people in and about among people for whom the Christian faith and indeed church membership or church attendance are perhaps a dead letter in their eyes. And yet these are the people we are called to witness to. And I hope this will be, you know, like a bit of fun to start with, but there's some very serious questions that emerge from it. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can, well, I'll share it when I actually have the thing that, there it is, right. That's it. Okay. Can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Yep. Splendid. I want to start with some quotations, but I've left out who actually said it. And you've got to try and guess who said it. Who said this? I do at times incline towards the highest doctrines of the church. I do have a great relish for sacrament. I do like the bells and the smells. I suppose it is the poetry of it. That great phrase in the Eucharist, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. I like the idea of the invisible and the spiritual, although spiritual is a horrible word to use these days. It so often encompasses the things I usually save my spleen for, horrible, new agey things. Who might have said that? Have some wild guesses.
I was thinking Betchman, but the language is too modern for Betchman.
Okay. You're right, it isn't
I was
Betchman.
thinking Betchman too.
No, it's not Betchman.
No.
Frank Skinner.
It isn't Frank Skinner. That was well thought through, though, because you were aware of the fact that I recommended Skinner's book the other day. But it's not Frank Skinner.
Which I've read.
Which we've got.
You're in the right kind of area, I have to say.
Not the Reverend Coles, is it?
It isn't Richard Coles. I would hope that he did at times incline towards the highest doctrines of the church, being an ordained priest. The answer will surprise you. It's Stephen Fry.
Oh, right.
Oh, yes. Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Stephen Fry, who is, of course, a committed humanist and atheist.
And Radio 4 Lovey.
And a Radio 4 Lovey of great repute.
And BBC's pet gay man, together with Richard Coles.
Well, they are an awesome pairing. That's the first quotation. Here's the second. Who said this? This is a bit earlier. The endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words, and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death. But nearness to death no nearer to God. Any ideas?
Sounds hugely depressing.
Mm.
It's a commentary, and as you'll discover in a minute, it's actually a commentary that has aged incredibly well. It was written in 1927.
C.S. Lewis.
The right sort of rhythm in the name,
Oh.
but good effort.
T.S. Eliot.
It is indeed Thomas Stearns Eliot, writing about the contemporary occupation with activity and idea and doing rather than being. And it is actually, I think, a perfect descriptor of where the church currently finds herself in so many ways. And that was written in 1927. It's nearly 100 years old. Let's have another go. Oh. Bit simpler, this one. Jesus, yes. The church, no. All wild guesses are appropriate. No answer too silly enough.
Sounds like a modern evangelist, maybe.
Modern,
Evangelist.
yeah, it isn't an evangelist, but so, well, not in a Christian sense. In many ways, it's the most withering of the statements you're going to read this evening. Recognizing as it does that for many people, the church is not a place where they can discover Jesus, which means we're getting something wrong. It's actually Mick Jagger.
Oh.
This one's
A
fascinating.
politician.
This one. What kind of an organization is it that makes itself available as a local post office and requires virtually nothing of its adherents? The most characteristic English statement about belief is, well, I'm not particularly religious, faintly embarrassed by the suggestion that there might be something more to life. It seems the Church of England thinks God is the ultimate good chap. I can actually hear the person who wrote that. I can hear it in his voice.
Mm.
It's in a book. But again, the person who said it is very well known.
The only person I can think is Richard Holloway.
It's not Richard Holloway, but I like the way you're thinking. It's not anyone connected directly with the church.
Oh.
It's an extract from a book written by Jeremy Paxman.
Oh,
Yes, it sounds like him.
Yeah, doesn't it just?
Mm.
Here's a there we are. Slightly more light-hearted. It is frankly amazing that Christianity survived the invention of the tambourine.
Is that one, Frank Skinner?
It isn't, but you're in the right area. The person concerned is famous, though, and is a churchgoer.
Tamarines remind me of the Salvation Army, but whether that's a clue.
Nope.
Sounds like a Milton Jones quote.
That's closer than you think. It isn't Milton Jones, but it could quite easily be. It's actually Jack Dee. And now we move on to some quotes that I've attributed, because they're sort of case studies, if you will, for opinions and ideas that we meet when people are anxious to argue as to why they do not come to church, why they do not believe, all that sort of thing. And they are intelligent, they are thought through, and they deserve to be taken seriously. So here's the first one. This is John Diamond. John Diamond died 20 years ago now of cancer, and he said these words as well in the last days of his life. There is no level at which the evangelists and I can engage. They tell me about their spiritual product as if I might not have come across it before, as if in 47 years of living in a Christian country, I might not yet have stumbled upon the concept of Christ as Redeemer. They don't seem to understand that I can't force myself to believe what I don't believe, which is the point at which agnostics usually say, I only wish I could believe. And I used to say that myself.
Jewish.
But I've discovered that it's not true. I'm happy not believing. And that's what the evangelists don't seem to understand. People are free to believe or not. And I find concerning the reduction of the message of evangelism as a spiritual product. That's damning, I think, as if we're trying to sell it like soap powder. And it doesn't work like that.
Which is broadly true.
Well, indeed. I have the greatest respect for this statement in terms of the way the church goes about the business of proclaiming the gospel. It's an often, it is such a problem to stay focused on the person of Jesus Christ, which is what an evangelist is meant to do, for heaven's sake. It's what we're all meant to do. But we package it. I remember an archdeacon in one diocese I worked in who used to talk about, we have to market the gospel. And I used to just shudder whenever I heard that, because it was playing right into the hands of the John Diamond argument. Here's something from a very fine bishop, the retired Bishop of Manchester, Nigel McCulloch.
Retired.
The issue that the churches must face up to is not so much that people do not believe in God, but that they do not find the churches credible. So again, this is a variant on the Mick Jagger quote. Jesus, yes, the church, no. The credibility of the church. Those of you who were at the PCC meeting at Holy Trinity last night will be aware of a situation which I described, in which a priest in the Diocese of London, who had no allegation against him, who had no formal complaints, but only shreds and rumors of misbehavior, committed suicide because he knew that he was under investigation for something, but nobody would tell him what. And the credibility of the church, as that story has unfolded over the last 2 or 3 days, has taken a severe beating. And so is the church credible? Does it live the life that it is called to live? That's the point that McCulloch is making. People don't find the church credible. Part of that is no doubt to do with the way the media portrays the church, but there's no disguising the fact that the church has serious, serious problems when it comes to perception. And it spends millions and millions of pounds on communications, and it's absolutely disastrous at a national level. And it affects our capacity to speak confidently of the Christ we know.
Yes.
I think there's something which is very important to remember. The church is full of sinners.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is.
And it's the perception that people have of the church, which is wrong.
Well, I think that is true to some extent, but I would also want to say that for an institution that is supposedly run by competent people, it does make an awful lot of very public mistakes.
Would challenge, Father, not you, but I would challenge any understanding that the church is run competently.
Well, perhaps. Well,
by competent people.
By competent people, but I would suggest that many mistakes are made. Particularly at the national level. And
I would at all levels. The same thing about believability too.
Well, yes. But every time there's a news story, every time there's something, it affects our capacity to speak with any sort of power or with effectiveness, because we know the backdrop against which we're speaking. I vividly remember in 2012 in Oxford, we were proposing to put on a passion play in the streets of Oxford. This was at St. Stephen's House. We'd done one 2 years previously, and it had been a remarkable success. And we alerted the police and the local authority to our plans because it would involve a certain amount of abnormal traffic on a main road. And they didn't reply. Nobody replied until the very last minute, when the local authority got in touch with us and they prevented it from taking place. Now, it was a simple misunderstanding. Unfortunately, one of the tabloid newspapers got hold of it, and the way they portrayed it was that the local authority, the person who had dealt with it, had thought that a passion play was some sort of sex show. Oh. They had no idea what a passion play was. And I'm sorry to say, all right, that's perhaps a piece of remarkable ignorance. But I'm sorry to say that as a result of that story, the individual concerned was hounded by evangelical Christians in Oxford. And he had to move out of his house, and so did his wife. And the whole thing was an absolute catastrophe. I then went to Australia later in the year to do some mission work in the Diocese of the Murray. And when I arrived there, one of the people who I was working with pulled out their wallet and solemnly gave me a cutting from the Adelaide Star. And it was telling that story. They didn't realize that I was the producer.
Oh.
But it was because that's how far these false stories have a capacity to spread. And it's very hard to recover from things like that. And a lot of damage was done, actually. A lot of damage. It took a lot of repairing, not least the person who was unnecessarily victimized by people who overreacted. But that's how it starts. You strike a match over a tinderbox, and that's what happens. George Monbiot is a journalist, and he writes this: I was brought up with the classic middle-class Anglican stance, which effectively means plenty of form and very little function, and just a semblance of belief. Going through the ritual of going to church on Sunday morning, but not allowing your professed belief to interfere in any way with the way you lead your life. It's a very easy ethos to shed because it isn't really an ethos at all. What counts is what churches do, much more than what they profess. They must match the positive things they say with action. It was phrased thus by somebody at General Synod: you can believe anything if you're an Anglican, as long as you don't believe it very much. We have a reputation for a dilution of faith, a faith that is form rather than substance, that doesn't translate into action. I don't think it's entirely true, but I think there's enough truth in it for us to think hard. And this perhaps comes back to the credibility question. Father Timothy Radcliffe is a Dominican. He's based in Oxford, a very fine man indeed, and he puts his finger on the heart of what has been problematic for so many in terms of trying to address the way in which we witness in the contemporary age. He speaks of the crisis of sexual abuse across all the mainstream denominations, but particularly in his case about the Roman Catholic Church, of which he's a member. This terrible crisis of sexual abuse is deeply linked to the way that power can corrupt human relationships, which is why it touches all the churches, even if the Catholic Church happens to have been more in the spotlight recently. Celibacy is not, I believe, the source of the crisis. We shall only really address this crisis if we learn from Jesus, who is gentle and lowly of heart, and find ways of embodying authority which honor the equal dignity of all the baptized and cherish the weak and the vulnerable. For Radcliffe, the misuse of power lies at the heart of these abuses and this crisis. And it is not, as he points out, it is not simply one church or denomination that must look hard at itself. We've all noticed the prominence, the rise to prominence of safeguarding and the safeguarding culture. And it is in direct response to this. I wonder whether simply creating more rules helps us to do this. What we surely need first and foremost is a renewal of our spiritual lives, and hence a more Christ-like understanding of authority, so that we can meet this particular challenge with fresh eyes and fresh faces. But if you ever get the chance to read anything that Timothy Radcliffe has written, take it. He is superb and the most charming of men. So there are a series of challenges there. What do we do when the church is perceived to be separated from her source, i.e. Jesus? That's Mick Jagger's view. What do we do to counteract the impressions of blandness and lack of challenge that Jeremy Paxman points to? What do we do when people are happy without the gospel, as in John Diamond's case? How valuable, how important is the notion of credibility, as Bishop Nigel McCulloch points out? How do we address the question, less talk, more action, that George Monbiot mentions? And how do we rebuild the trust, which Timothy Radcliffe points out has been so egregiously betrayed and broken? I want to suggest some ways forward and some challenges. The most important things that we can do when we hear these contrary perspectives are to listen, and listen actively, and try to understand what is being said. I really like the picture in the bottom right. Only if we fought just as hard to understand as we do to disagree. I rather like that. If we expended the energy on trying to understand one another that we often spend in conflict with one another, it would be a much, much better world than it currently is. Respect is a mutual thing. Even if you disagree with the view that's being expressed, you respect the right of the other to put that view. You listen to it carefully and courteously before offering a vision of your own. And we begin then, I mean, there's one word that sums up that slide, and it's the word humility. None of us as individuals, and certainly not as a group, have all the answers to all the great questions. And the insights of others contain wisdom. We need to listen and be respectful and seek to understand, seek to find common ground, if you like. And here's a bit of a challenge, because at the heart of our understanding of Jesus as those who wish to witness as Christians, there is a great paradox. This explains something really puzzling about Jesus. He ate and drank with prostitutes and tax collectors. He had the most disreputable friends. He did not wait until they had repented before he invited them to the table. He did not say, "Look, Joanna, once you have been off the street for a week, you can come to my party." He accepted them as they were. And yet, he preached the Sermon on the Mount. He commanded his disciples to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies, to never be angry, to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. He is very demanding. How could we do both of these, be unreservedly welcoming, apparently lax, and yet at the same time be very demanding? The exigencies were those of God's friendship. It is only in the visible context of friendship that we can give moral teaching. This realization has radical consequences for the way in which the church teaches a moral vision. What we have to say only makes sense in the context of friendship. If we want to speak on questions like abortion or divorce and remarriage or the gay issue, then we must befriend people who think differently from us. So this yoke of Jesus is easy and his burden is light because it is the offer of his friendship, and it can only be communicated in his friendship. Indeed, what is to be said can only be discovered in friendship. It is only side by side, sharing the struggle and the search, that we will be given the right word. Overload food for thought there, I would have thought. Who would like to kick off the conversation?
I think all these people really are missing something which is so wonderful. What they're looking for is the hypocritical in the church. And we have to admit that we are hypocrites. But they don't. Something else about that as well is that Jesus took us from where we are to where he wants us to be. And we've committed our lives to a greater or lesser degree to following his wishes. But these people stand on the outside and look in and say, look at those hypocrites. Rather than saying, I too need to come to the cross and say, my Jesus saved me, for I'm sorry for my sins. They're not on the same wavelength. And that's not, the church doesn't have to beat itself up because of that. There are other things at work within society today which militate against a Christian understanding of life.
Yes.
I'll stop there because otherwise I'll start to dominate things.
But we are not above criticism, are we? If you consider the counsel of perfection, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That sets the bar pretty high, actually.
Yes.
Doesn't it? It is, to many, I suppose, unattainable this side of heaven. And we will fall short time and time and time again. That is the nature of the Christian journey. What matters is how you get up. And there will always be criticisms, but what I didn't hear was a criticism of moral vision in people like John Diamond. It was more a criticism, what in theology you'd call a criticism of apologetics. It's how we witness to, how we put people in touch with this Jesus, or whether we are ever able to do that at all. going back to the Mick Jagger thing. You know, Jesus, yes, the church, no. There's someone who would accept the teachings of Jesus if there were a more credible witness, perhaps. And Jagger doesn't find that in the church. And so the beginning of all of this is self-examination. And increasingly, please God, living the lives of holiness that we are called to live. Because that's the most effective way of witnessing in the everyday stuff. And we're all flawed and wounded in one way and another. I think it starts.
How many people have actually are uttering this stuff actually attempted to understand Christians?
I don't know. I don't know whether they're in it to get a good gig. Some are, some aren't. But I think we have to take seriously the comments of others when they strike home and reveal part of the truth of our existence. Otherwise we never change.
Yes. But if we're seeking perfection as the way as how we're going to be judged, well, that's, as I say, one has to accept that from the Almighty.
Yes.
He will. But
I work. You know me. I work on the basis that we can only change ourselves. We can't change what other people say. We can't change what other people think of us. We can only change ourselves with faltering steps. And that's where criticism is helpful. As long as we remember at its heart that we are always and still a people of joy. That's my kind of recurring theme at the moment, I'm afraid. I think you're all getting a bit sick of the word joy, but it's true. I came across a quote today. Joy is choosing to place one's happiness where it properly belongs, holding on to what is true and real, whether we feel it or not. That's from a book that Father Roger recommended to me, just so he knows that I'm reading it. Sam?
I think, if I think back to conversations I've had with colleagues, work colleagues, or friends who don't really know much about Christian faith at all, they all seem really surprised, I think, when I tell them that I'm a Christian and I believe in Jesus and I go to church, because I do think there's this perfection and holier than thou image. They're surprised that someone like me, which I don't know whether to be flattered or offended by, really, could give myself a Christian label, because, to them I'm a normal person.
Yeah.
So that there is that perception that you need to be perfect and pious and po-faced maybe, and they forget. And even myself, to a certain extent, when I was younger, you forget that people involved in church, we're just people. Yeah. Priests are people. Yeah. We've got the foibles and quirks that we all have. We have the same sense of humour. Everybody likes a dad joke now and again. And, it's just, how do you crack that? I suppose the only way is to just have frank conversations with people and just show them by your own witness that it's it's a normal thing to do.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think it comes back to, a stock phrase that I've used for many years now is that the first rule of evangelism is friendship. It is in the act of befriending, and that whole business of listening and respect and understanding. Jesus was prepared to inhabit our space when we were going in the wrong direction. And that's a pattern for us. That's a model for us in our relationships with other people. The story of the road to Emmaus in Luke, Jesus joins those two disciples while they're walking in the wrong direction, away from Jerusalem. And he keeps going with them. And only through his presence, his words, and his witness in the breaking of the bread do they then turn round late at night and head back to Jerusalem, which is where all the action is. And by the same token, part of our witnessing is to be immersed in this other stuff and bring a freshness and a renewal to it, and to maybe change the sort of perceptions that you're talking about with work colleagues. It is. I mean, that's the world in which we're living. If we stood back and realized just how kind of rarefied it all seems to other people, we'd be horrified. But you're quite right. People think, but you can't possibly go to church. You're entirely normal.
Yes.
And you like the odd cocktail and a night at the theatre and all that kind of thing. How could you possibly? I mean, I get this when I go and watch football.
Yeah.
It's from my footy mates who cannot for the life of them believe that I could be a priest. Just doesn't fit with their narrative. But given the conversations and the friendships that are formed, they come to respect it.
Yeah.
And so that's got to be worth doing. And anyway, I enjoy it. So, what are you going to do?
And actually, I found 2-3 people through those conversations that are Christians in different sort of denominations, and it's it's led to some really good new friendships, I think. So it does help to be brave enough to speak about what you do, because there's always that feeling that you shouldn't talk about sex, religion, or politics, should you, with people? It's like taboo. But I don't mind talking about a bit of all of those things with people. Which
I found when I was at work that people were a bit embarrassed when I said I was a Girl Guide leader and I went to church and I was a Christian, and they were all a bit sort of embarrassed. Well, how do I treat you now?
Yeah.
It was really odd.
Yeah.
It was as if I would be a different person than the person I was.
Mm.
Yeah, it was really odd.
Do you think, therefore, Verity, that, and I apologise for the dog in the background, do you think, therefore, it is incumbent upon us who are in this particular, we are the kind of misunderstood, it's incumbent upon us to travel further in terms of helping other people to understand what drives us and what motivates us, rather than saying, oh, well, that's their problem. If we're going to witness, we maybe need to move further than we might otherwise do.
I did try, but the problem was the sort of pressure we were under at work. It was almost impossible to have a long conversation with somebody. I mean, there was always a phone call coming through. There was always a client waiting to be seen. It was almost impossible. I mean, most of us didn't even have a lunch hour. And
Sure.
if we did, we had training meetings in lunch hours. It was sort of, it wasn't the opportunity never arose because we were all under too much pressure.
I think it depends, doesn't it, on the context of your work. If you're in a kind of work that allows for conversation of that sort, then that's great. But most of the time, people aren't in that kind of luxurious position, really. No. I mean, I remember working when I was a student, working in a factory and working in a petrol station, and those sort of repetitive jobs that allowed for conversation, you could do that. But as life got a bit more cerebral, it became more and more difficult. I mean, as a teacher, there were very few occasions when one could have those sorts of conversations, for exactly the reasons that you're pointing out. But I think it also goes for our circles of friends. You know, we've already all got friends, and probably we've already all got friends who are not part of a church or any sort of denomination at all. And maybe that's the place to start. Years ago, we tried a project in which we encouraged everyone to, this was when I was in another place, we were encouraged to write down the names of 5 people who didn't come to church, but who were friends of ours, and who would say, well, you know, that's somebody who I get on well with, that's somebody with whom there's mutual trust, you know, all that kind of thing, and for whom that sort of conversation would be really much easier than if you were doing it cold. And the sort of people who would be able to come to you in trust and say, what's all that about then? And if, I mean, I was fascinated by what you're saying about that sort of the overly pious perception of you know, people looking at the church. I remember Nick Walters, Father Nick Walters now, who was at Holy Trinity a few years ago on placement, telling us that that the church was not the community of the perfect, it was actually a hospital for sinners. So if that's the case, why do we not look a bit more like that? What is it about our demeanor that is actually giving another rather contrary message to people? I don't know the answer. I was rather hoping one of you might.
I think at ground level, I think the church is seen much more as an organisation, much more as a club, of which you are a member, and it is seriously mistrusted. I think it's seen as rich. I've heard it time and time again. As
We only want your money.
The Church of England, and I'm talking about the Church of England here, yeah, is very rich. I think it's seen as very middle class.
Yeah, it is.
And I think thereby lies one of the big problems. Because we've moved away from the social aspects, haven't we, of the Church of England, where years ago, when I was young, the whole village virtually went to church because it was social. It was a social thing.
There was nothing else.
No, there wasn't.
No.
And consequently, people then had a common belief. I'm not saying that it was a common belief in Jesus Christ.
No.
But it was a common belief. And that pulled people together. Yeah. What we've got now is people in all directions. People who are, dare I say, probably better educated. And therefore, this is why we get some of the quotes that you have quoted this evening.
Sure.
But it's seen as terribly middle class.
It is. I'd be really interested at this point to hear how middle class Jill Fenner thinks the church is from her observations of the lifeboats. Yeah. Because that's I think the one area that we're familiar with that perhaps bucks the trend that you're talking about.
Yes, I'm sure. Mm. But there is a reason for that, isn't there?
There is. It's partly because of location. It's partly because of emphasis. And it's because of need.
Yes, the need. It is this word need.
Yeah. Jill, what do you reckon?
I think I think a lot of the people that come to the project, they aren't Christians. But then there are some that are obviously are. When you get involved in a conversation with them, and that to me shows me how humble I am in that situation. When you encounter someone that we encountered, Father Ross and myself, on Sunday, and it's the lady that's sending clothes out to Nigeria.
Yeah.
And she's obviously got money, but she's sent because she gives donations to the project. But she's sending the clothes to somewhere that hasn't got anything. And I just equate it to how Jesus and the saints were, you know, giving to the poor, and that is continually at the forefront of my mind. And yes, there are some that come along, the cadge pennies, I call them. But you just think, well, God is watching this. God is seeing what we are doing, and leave it with him. He will sort that out. But just back to this woman on Sunday, she came in and she was apologising for bringing two young, boisterous lads, probably Father Ross, aged about 5 and 6 or 7.
They were 5 and 3.
Oh, were they? Yes, he
Yeah.
was. He was younger. And she apologised for bringing these lads, and they were quite boisterous. And she turned around, she said, "I am so sorry, but their dad dropped dead yesterday." And both Father Ross and myself just looked at one another and back at her. He was a Nigerian guy, 42-year-old Nigerian guy, dropped dead on the spot. And she was looking after, because as she said, the mum was heavily sedated. Well, wouldn't you be?
Yes.
And that just brings you to your knees, actually. I mean, we've seen, strangely enough, it's always Father Ross and myself, I think, that encounter these people. But we have seen and met some horrendous situations, and it just brings you back to what we're saying about being more Christ-like. And one of the things, I guess, that makes me think, what is this all about sometimes, when you go into a strange church and people look at you because you're sitting in their seat in the church, and you think, hang on a minute, it's not your seat, it's God's seat in his house.
That's interesting.
And that, you know, brings you back to the upper crust middle class, who don't make you feel welcome when you go into God's house, that happens to be in their area.
So it seems from what you're saying that welcome is incredibly important. And if, to go back to the last couple of slides, the paradox of universal welcome over and against this Jesus who calls us to conversion of life, to use a good Benedictine phrase, that we somehow have to live out that paradox, that we're all people on a journey. We've discovered our need of God, we've discovered our sin, but we respond to that with joy because grace overcomes, etc., etc. And it's how we convey that paradox, really, isn't it, to others in what I would only describe as a classless way. And that's really hard, because we are all people of a particular class.
Of course.
That's just the society we live in. But we must try to find ways of being approachable, being able to help people overcome fear, and maybe discover with us something that we the treasure that we have found. I mean, I'll embarrass Beryl now, because a few years ago, just after I'd arrived at Holy Trinity, a friend of ours from Yorkshire came to stay, and I prepared her for confirmation in my first parish in Harrogate, and she came into Holy Trinity. She was a complete stranger to everybody except me, and she was made incredibly welcome. And whoever was handing out the stuff, because I think, Beryl, you were just recovering from your surgery, weren't you? You weren't in the choir, and you offered to sit with this lady so that she would be all right and know what to do and where we were in the service. And Beryl wasn't to know that Dot was an incredibly experienced churchgoer just from somewhere else. And when we got back after Mass, I asked Dot what it had been like, and she said she'd never been made more welcome anywhere in her whole life. And I thought to myself, that's a tremendously healthy sign. And I hope that in all the culture changes that we've been talking about and trying to analyze as a result of pandemic and everything else, that we don't lose sight of that human touch, of the interpersonal. You know, people come for reassurance and for support and just to be, and we need to find out what it is they need very quickly when they come and visit us. Anyway, that's been marvelous. Thank you all very much indeed for being here this evening and so many other evenings. As I said earlier, there won't be a session next week because it's the St Martin's PCC meeting, but Father Ross will be picking up. If you haven't let me have that GDPR email, by the way, could you do so? Because obviously I'll need to keep a record of that. But thank you very much. And we will meet, or you will meet, in a fortnight's time on the 3rd of August, I think. Yeah, excellent. Splendid. Thank you one and all. Lovely to see you all as ever. See you
Bye,
very
everyone.
soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.